Hey, you're here. That's good. Let me tell you something. You've heard tales of legendary battles, of strategic brilliance and heroic triumphs. But what if I told you that beneath these celebrated narratives, there lies a darker, often overlooked truth, a tapestry woven with threads of profound human error? From the grandest empires to the most technologically advanced nations, catastrophic blunders have irrevocably altered the course of history, often with a whisper, not a shout. Imagine the tension in a dimly lit war room, the weight of a nation resting on a single decision, or the chilling realization on the battlefield that everything has gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. This isn't just about mistakes. It's about the hubris, the misjudgments, and the sheer, bewildering absurdity that can unravel even the most meticulously planned operations. We'll delve deep into these historical fiascos, exploring the chilling details, the forgotten warnings, and the far-reaching consequences that echo even today. You'll discover how ambition can blind, how communication can fail, and how the simplest oversight can lead to utter devastation, reshaping the world in ways no one anticipated. As you settle into a comfortable position, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. The unsettling story of humanity's most catastrophic military blunders is about to begin. Our journey into the annals of military miscalculation begins not with a bang, but with a strategic whimper that echoed through ancient Rome. Picture this. The year is 216 BC. Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general whose name still sends shivers down the spine of history buffs, had been wreaking havoc on the Italian peninsula for years, turning Roman legions into very expensive, very dead confetti. Rome, naturally, was not amused. After a series of stinging defeats, the Roman Senate decided to finally put an end to this Punic nuisance. They gathered an army of unprecedented size, somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 men, a truly formidable force for its time. To give you some perspective, that's roughly the population of a small modern city, all crammed into military formation, ready to teach Hannibal a lesson about who really ran the Mediterranean playground. The sheer numerical superiority was supposed to be the trump card, the ultimate equalizer against Hannibal's smaller, but undeniably more effective, army. Now, imagine the scene. The vast plains near Cannae, an open field perfect for what the Romans intended to do, overwhelmed the Carthaginians with sheer mass. The Roman consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, were in charge. Paulus was cautious, a seasoned veteran who understood the subtle art of not getting your entire army annihilated. Varro, on the other hand, was an eager beaver, full of bluster and convinced that brute force was the answer to all of life's problems, especially when facing a cunning adversary like Hannibal. And there, my friends, lay the first, subtle seed of impending disaster. On August 2nd, with Varro in command for the day, because apparently, sharing command of 80,000 men in the face of a genius general was a fantastic idea, the Romans deployed their legions. They packed their infantry into a deep, dense formation, believing that this concentrated weight would simply punch through Hannibal's lines. It was a strategy akin to trying to win a chess game by slamming your king onto the opponent's board and declaring victory through sheer presence. Hannibal, meanwhile, was observing all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a maestro preparing his orchestra for a particularly dramatic symphony. His army was significantly smaller, around 50,000 men, but it was a diverse mix of Gauls, Iberians, Africans, and his elite Numidian cavalry, all fiercely loyal and expertly trained. He deployed his forces in a crescent formation, with his weaker Gallic and Iberian infantry in the center, bulging forward towards the Romans, and his veteran African infantry held back on the flanks. His cavalry, stronger and more numerous than the Roman equivalent, was positioned on the wings. It was a masterpiece of tactical deception, a giant, deadly bear trap disguised as an inviting hug. The battle began with the typical clash of infantry, a thunderous roar of men and steel. The Roman legions, with their immense weight, slowly but surely began to push back Hannibal's center. Varro, no doubt, was patting himself on the back, perhaps even mentally composing his victory speech. See, he might have thought, brute force always wins. But as the Roman center pushed deeper into the Carthaginian crescent, the flanks of Hannibal's line, the hardened African veterans, began to pivot inwards. It was a deadly embrace, not a retreat. Simultaneously, Hannibal's superior cavalry decisively routed the Roman cavalry on both wings, then circled around to attack the Roman legions from the rear. The Roman army, once a formidable spearhead, was now a tightly packed, immobile mass, encircled on three sides. This was the moment of quiet horror, the dawning realization of a truly catastrophic blunder. The deep formation that was supposed to be their strength became their coffin. Unable to maneuver, unable to fight effectively, the Roman soldiers were systematically cut down. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The sheer density of their formation meant that those in the middle couldn't even reach the enemy, while those on the outside were trapped, fighting for their lives against an enemy that surrounded them. The plain of Cannae became a vast, crimson tableau. Estimates of Roman casualties range from 50,000 to 70,000 dead, including Consul Paulus and a significant portion of the Roman senatorial class. It was arguably the single greatest tactical defeat in Roman history, a wound so deep it nearly broke the Republic. Varro, by some twist of fate, managed to escape, though his reputation, understandably, did not. The blunder at Cannae wasn't just about an arrogant general. It was about the dangerous illusion of overwhelming numerical superiority. It was a stark reminder that more isn't always better, especially when facing a strategic genius who understands the subtle art of turning an enemy's strength into their most profound weakness. This ancient lesson, tragically, would be forgotten and relearned many times throughout history, as we'll see in our next tale of military misadventure, where a simple miscommunication led to one of history's most famously valiant, yet utterly pointless, charges. From the sun-baked plains of ancient Cannae, we fast-forward to the muddy, wind-swept valleys of the Crimean War, specifically October 25, 1854, near Balaclava. Here, we witness a blunder that has become almost mythical in its tragic grandeur, the charge of the Light Brigade. Imagine, if you will, the scene. The British and French, allied with the Ottoman Empire, were attempting to seize the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. It was a confusing, often chaotic conflict, marked by poor logistics, questionable leadership, and the lingering scent of damp wool and bureaucratic ineptitude. Our focus, however, narrows to a specific valley, where a series of miscommunications and personality clashes converge to produce an event so spectacularly ill-conceived it defies belief. The British cavalry, glorious in their brightly colored uniforms, were comprised of two main brigades. The Heavy Brigade, a robust force suited for direct, powerful charges, and the Light Brigade, armed with sabers and lances, designed for speed, scouting, and swift flank attacks. Essentially, the cavalry equivalent of a precision scalpel, not a blunt hammer. The Russian forces held the high ground on three sides of a valley, bristling with artillery and infantry. They had captured some Turkish guns on a ridge, and it was these guns that became the unwitting catalysts for disaster. Lord Raglan, the overall British commander, was observing the battle from a vantage point high above the valley. He issued an order to his cavalry commander, Lord Lucan, to prevent the Russians from carrying away these guns. The order read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns." Troop of horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. Now, if you've ever played a game of telephone as a child, you'll understand the delightful chaos that ensues when information is relayed through multiple, increasingly flustered intermediaries. The order was delivered by Captain Lewis Edward Nolan, a fiery, impulsive aide who held a deep contempt for the cavalry's aristocratic, rather slow-moving, commanders. Lord Lucan, recipient of the order, looked down into the valley. He saw no guns being carried away. What he did see was a heavily fortified Russian battery at the far end of the valley, directly in the line of advance. He found the order utterly baffling. "Attack what guns, sir?" he famously asked Nolan. Nolan, pointing vaguely down the valley with a sweep of his arm, retorted, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." His tone, impatient and perhaps a touch disdainful, seemed to imply that only an imbecile would fail to grasp the obvious. Lucan, feeling his authority challenged and perhaps a tad embarrassed by Nolan's public condescension, then relayed the order to his brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan, who commanded the Light Brigade. Cardigan, a man renowned for his vanity, his petulant disposition, and his utter lack of tactical acumen, his preferred method of leading was from the front, literally riding into danger without much thought for what came next, was equally bewildered. He saw the same artillery battery at the end of the valley and the heavily defended heights on either side. He knew it was a suicidal mission. "But, sir," he protested to Lucan, "we have a battery in our front and batteries on either flank and a Russian force in rear of the battery." Lucan, apparently having had quite enough of this insubordination, simply stated, "I know it. But Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey." And so, at approximately 11:15 a.m., the Light Brigade, all 670 of them, mounted on their sleek horses, began their ill-fated charge down a mile-long valley of death. It was a sight of incredible bravery and astonishing folly. As they advanced, Russian artillery opened fire from three sides. Cannonballs tore through their ranks, horses screamed, men fell. The light cavalry, designed for speed and maneuver, were transformed into an easy target, like ducks in a shooting gallery. Captain Nolan, the messenger who had delivered the fatal order, rode ahead, perhaps realizing the horrendous mistake, perhaps trying to redirect them, but he was one of the first to fall, struck by a shell fragment. The brigade, astonishingly, reached the Russian guns. They cut down the gunners in a brief, brutal melee, a moment of fleeting triumph amidst overwhelming chaos. But there was no support. The heavy brigade, held back by Lucan, never followed through, and the French cavalry remained largely inactive. Surrounded and decimated, the remnants of the Light Brigade had no choice but to retreat back through the same valley of hell. Of the 670 men who charged, 110 were killed, 130 wounded, and 300 horses were lost. It was a military disaster, a tragic waste of human life driven by ambiguous orders, prideful stubbornness, and personal animosities. The blunder was not in the bravery of the soldiers, who performed their duty with astonishing courage, but in the chain of command, the lack of clarity, and the failure of leadership to question an order that clearly made no sense. It became a symbol of the futility of war and the catastrophic consequences of communication breakdown, a lesson that would be painfully relearned, yet again, in a bizarre incident where an entire army managed to defeat itself without any enemy intervention whatsoever. Our next tale takes us to a peculiar corner of history, a blunder so utterly baffling it sounds like something out of a Monty Python sketch. Imagine, if you will, the Austrian Empire in 1788, embroiled in a war against the Ottoman Turks. On the night of September 17th, near the town of Karansebes in modern-day Romania, the Austrian Imperial Army, a vast and multi-ethnic force of around 100,000 men, was preparing for an encounter with the enemy. The vanguard, a detachment of hussars, light cavalry known for their dash and daring, and perhaps a fondness for a good drink, crossed the Timmy's River to scout for Ottoman forces. As they ventured deeper into the darkness, a few miles ahead of the main army, they stumbled upon a group of Romani caravanners. Now, these weren't enemy combatants, but rather enterprising locals who happened to have a rather large supply of schnapps. And who, in their right mind, would say no to schnapps after a long day of scouting in the wilderness? Certainly not a hussar. A deal was struck, and the hussars began to enjoy their liquid refreshment. Soon after, a company of Austrian infantry also crossed the river and, hearing the raucous sounds of merriment, decided to join the party. Upon arrival, they rather unsportingly demanded a share of the schnapps. The hussars, having procured the spirits themselves, refused to share. This, naturally, led to a heated argument. The kind of argument that only fully grown men, fueled by alcohol and the general tensions of war, can truly achieve. One thing led to another. A shot was fired, whether accidentally or in anger, history does not precisely record, and the argument escalated from a drunken brawl to a full-blown firefight between elements of the same army. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Austrians were now fighting themselves over schnapps. It was a classic hold my beer moment, escalated to an unimaginable scale. As the gunfire echoed through the night, some of the hussars, perhaps seeing shapes in the dark or genuinely believing they were under attack, began to shout, "Turci!" Turci, meaning Turks. Turks, in Romanian. This cry, whether a genuine mistake or a drunken jest, spread like wildfire through the Austrian ranks. Confusion, that ever-present companion of military blunders, descended like a thick fog. In the darkness, with the sounds of gunfire and the panicked shouts of Turks, the chaos began to spiral. Officers, unable to discern friend from foe, began issuing conflicting orders. Some commanded a charge, others a retreat. Troops stumbled over each other, firing wildly at shadows. The German-speaking officers would shout commands, which were often misunderstood or misinterpreted by the multitude of other ethnic groups within the army, including Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, and Romanians, who spoke different languages. Imagine the scene. A unit hears Turci and starts firing. Another unit, hearing the firing, assumes they are under attack from the Turks and returns fire. Soon, entire regiments were engaging each other in the darkness, each side convinced they were fighting the Ottoman enemy. An Austrian general, attempting to restore order, supposedly shouted "Halt!" But in the cacophony of the night, some interpreted it as Allah, believing it to be an enemy battle cry, thus escalating the friendly fire even further. The most astonishing part of this entire fiasco is that the main Austrian army, some distance away, heard the commotion. Emperor Joseph II himself, who was with the main body, was awoken by the sounds of the battle. In the total darkness, the confusion spread to his camp. Artillery was brought up and fired into the melee, adding friendly shell fire to the friendly musket fire. Horses bolted, wagons overturned, and men fled in sheer terror, many drowning in the Timmy's River as they tried to escape the imaginary enemy. By morning, when the sun finally cast its revealing light upon the scene, the full extent of the calamity became horrifyingly clear. The Austrian army had inflicted staggering casualties upon itself. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 soldiers were either killed, wounded, or went missing, all before a single Ottoman soldier had even arrived. When the actual Ottoman forces finally appeared 2 days later, they found the battlefield littered with dead and wounded Austrian soldiers, and a thoroughly disorganized and demoralized Austrian army in full retreat. The Ottomans, surely baffled by this seemingly divine intervention, simply occupied Karansebes without a fight. The Battle of Karansebes stands as a testament to the destructive power of miscommunication, alcohol, panic, and the sheer absurdity of human nature under pressure. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy is not across the battlefield, but within your own ranks, particularly if a barrel of schnapps is involved. This self-inflicted wound, a truly magnificent military blunder, shows us that even without an enemy present, an army can dismantle itself with remarkable efficiency. This chaotic incident underscores how easily even a well-equipped force can unravel, a theme we'll revisit as we examine a grand, yet ultimately doomed, airborne operation of the next century. From the bewildering self-destruction at Catastrophic, we leap forward to the grand, yet ultimately tragic, stage of World War II. The year is 1944. The Allies, fresh from the D-Day landings and the liberation of Paris, were sweeping through France and Belgium, feeling rather pleased with themselves. The mood in the Allied command was one of almost giddy optimism. The war, surely, would be over by Christmas. This boundless confidence led to one of the most audacious and ultimately ill-fated military operations in history, Operation Market Garden. Conceived by the flamboyant and famously overconfident British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Market Garden was a plan of breathtaking scope. The idea was simple, yet incredibly complex in execution. Use massive airborne forces, American, British, and Polish paratroopers, to seize a series of crucial bridges over major rivers in the Netherlands. Once these bridges were secured, a ground force, the British XXX Corps, would drive rapidly over them, outflank the formidable German Siegfried Line, and effectively open a rapid route into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. The market part of the operation referred to the airborne assault, the largest such operation ever attempted at that point, involving more than 34,000 paratroopers and glider-borne infantry. The Garden referred to the ground advance. Montgomery's vision was bold: bypass the stalemates of trench warfare and end the war swiftly. It was, however, a gamble of monumental proportions, betting on perfect timing, flawless execution, and a rapid collapse of German resistance. And as history often reminds us, the house usually wins when you bet too big. The plan, while audacious, was plagued by a multitude of optimistic assumptions and ignored intelligence. For instance, Allied intelligence had spotted two crack SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, resting and refitting in the Arnhem area, precisely where the British 1st Airborne Division was supposed to land and secure the crucial bridge over the Lower Rhine. When these reports reached Montgomery, they were largely dismissed as phantom panzers or simply ignored. The assumption was that the Germans were too broken to offer serious resistance. This was, as we shall see, a catastrophic misjudgment of the enemy's resilience. The airborne landings on September 17th began well enough, if not perfectly. Paratroopers descended from the sky, gliders landed, and the initial objectives were largely secured. However, right from the start, things began to go awry. Radio equipment for the British 1st Airborne Division proved notoriously unreliable, making communication between units, and with XXX Corps, incredibly difficult. This meant crucial updates on German movements or requests for support were often delayed or never received. The terrain itself also posed unexpected challenges. The narrow, elevated roads through the Dutch countryside, known as Hell's Highway, became choke points, easily ambushed by resurgent German forces. The ground advance of XXX Corps, instead of being a lightning thrust, became a slow, grinding struggle against determined German resistance and constant ambushes. And then there was the Arnhem Bridge, the crown jewel of the operation, the bridge too far. The British 1st Airborne, initially tasked with capturing it, faced far stiffer resistance than anticipated. Those phantom panzers turned out to be very real, very heavily armed, and very much prepared to fight. The fighting around Arnhem became desperate, a brutal house-to-house, street-by-street battle against overwhelming German numbers. The paratroopers, lightly armed and quickly running low on ammunition, were left isolated, their cries for ground support often unheard or unfulfilled due to the aforementioned communication problems and the bogged-down ground advance. For 9 days, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne fought with extraordinary bravery, holding out against immense odds in what became a desperate siege. But the odds were stacked against them. Their supplies dwindled, their casualties mounted, and the promised ground relief never arrived in time. By September 26th, the survivors, battered and exhausted, were forced to withdraw, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. Operation Market Garden was a catastrophic failure. Of the 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division who went into Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. The war, far from being over by Christmas, dragged on for another 8 months. The blunder was a painful lesson in the dangers of overconfidence, of dismissing intelligence that contradicts a favored plan, and of the perilous complexity of large-scale combined arms operations. It showed that even with overwhelming force and daring ideas, a single critical oversight, or a few ignored warnings, can turn a grand vision into a grinding nightmare. This daring, yet doomed, gamble in the autumn of 1944 reminds us that sometimes, even the most meticulous planning can be undone by an underestimation of logistics, a challenge that would famously plague one of history's greatest conquerors during his disastrous campaign in the vast Russian winter. Our journey through military miscalculations now transports us to the vast, unforgiving plains of Russia in 1812, where even the greatest military mind of his era, Napoleon Bonaparte, would meet his most crushing defeat. This wasn't just a battle. It was an epic struggle against logistics, geography, and the brutal indifference of winter itself. Napoleon, having conquered most of Europe and crowned himself emperor, stood at the zenith of his power. He had built the Grande Armée, a multinational force of staggering proportions, numbering over 600,000 men. This was not merely an army. It was an entire nation on the march, complete with a sprawling logistical tail intended to support it. The objective: compel Tsar Alexander I of Russia to adhere to the continental system, Napoleon's ambitious blockade designed to cripple Britain. It was, in essence, a forced economic alliance, and Russia's refusal to play ball was a personal affront to the emperor's grand vision of a unified Europe under French dominance. The campaign began in June 1812, with the Grande Armée crossing the Neman River into Russia. The sheer scale of the undertaking was unprecedented. Imagine columns of hundreds of thousands of men, stretching for miles, accompanied by vast numbers of horses, cannons, and supply wagons, all moving across sparsely populated, often unpaved, terrain. It was a logistical nightmare from day one. One of Napoleon's fundamental blunders was his underestimation of Russia's immense size and its scorched earth strategy. The Russian army, under Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, largely refused to engage in a decisive battle. Instead, they continually retreated, drawing the French deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia, burning crops, destroying villages, and poisoning wells as they went. This left the Grande Armée with dwindling local supplies and an ever-lengthening supply line, which was already strained to breaking point. Diseases like typhus and dysentery ravaged the ranks, and desertion became rampant. By the time they reached Smolensk, just 2 months into the campaign, over half the original force was already gone, lost not to battle, but to disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The cavalry, vital for reconnaissance, was particularly decimated, as horses perished from lack of forage. This was a slow, agonizing attrition, a logistical chokehold that was far more effective than any pitched battle. The only major engagement, the Battle of Borodino in September, was a bloody, indecisive slugfest where both sides suffered horrendous casualties. Napoleon finally entered a deserted and burning Moscow in mid-September, expecting to find provisions and a Russian desire for peace. Instead, he found a city largely abandoned, burning, and offering no strategic value. It was a hollow victory, a ghost town that offered no respite for his exhausted army. His great blunder was lingering there, expecting peace overtures that never came. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in Moscow, hoping for a surrender that never materialized, while the harsh Russian winter, General Winter, as it would famously be called, began to close in. The first snow fell in mid-October. Realizing the perilous situation, Napoleon finally ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Grande Army, already weakened, now faced the full wrath of the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to below freezing, turning roads into icy quagmires and starving horses into frozen carcasses. Men froze to death in their sleep, starved, or succumbed to frostbite. Discipline collapsed. The retreat became a desperate, harrowing race for survival. The pursuing Russian army, aided by Cossack irregulars and partisans, harried the flanks and rear, turning every halt into a skirmish. The crossing of the Berezina River in November was a particularly horrific episode, where thousands perished in the icy waters under constant Russian bombardment. By the time the ragged remnants of the Grande Army stumbled back across the Neman River in December, only an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 men remained of the original 600,000. It was a complete and utter catastrophe, not primarily due to military defeat on the battlefield, but to a profound underestimation of geography, climate, and the enemy's willingness to endure. Napoleon's Russian campaign stands as a stark warning against overextension, against ignoring the fundamental principles of supply and logistics, and against underestimating the resolve of a nation defending its homeland. The frozen dreams of imperial glory turned into a chilling reality for hundreds of thousands, a vivid reminder that even the most brilliant strategies can crumble when faced with the unforgiving realities of nature and a patient, evasive foe. This monumental logistical failure sets the stage for our next historical stumble, where a similar underestimation of local knowledge and cunning led to a devastating ambush in the ancient forests of Germania. From the icy grip of the Russian winter, we now rewind the clock nearly 2 millennia to the ancient, brooding forests of Germania, a place where Roman imperial hubris would meet its savage reckoning. Our story takes place in 9 AD, a time when the Roman Empire, under Emperor Augustus, was at the peak of its power, seemingly unstoppable. The Romans had pushed their legions eastward, beyond the Rhine, eager to consolidate their control over the vast, untamed territories they called Germania Magna. It was an ambitious, perhaps even arrogant, expansion, driven by the desire for resources, glory, and the simple Roman belief that their way of life was inherently superior and destined to encompass all known lands. The key figure in this unfolding tragedy was Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor of Germania. Varus was a man of considerable administrative experience, but one who possessed a fatal flaw: an utter contempt for the Germanic tribes he governed. He saw them as unsophisticated barbarians, easily subjugated and ripe for Romanization. He believed they could be taxed and governed like any other Roman province, a monumental misjudgment of their fierce independence and deep-seated animosity towards their Roman conquerors. His arrogance led him to disregard warnings and to march his legions with a casual disregard for their surroundings, as if strolling through a Roman park rather than a hostile wilderness. His local guide and trusted advisor was a young Cheruscan chieftain named Arminius. Arminius, or Hermann as he is known in German lore, was a fascinating and complex figure. He had been educated in Rome, served in the Roman army, and even attained Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. He spoke Latin fluently, understood Roman military tactics intimately, and had seemingly assimilated into Roman culture. He was, in effect, the ultimate insider threat, playing the part of a loyal subordinate while secretly harboring a burning desire to liberate his people from Roman rule. Varus, blinded by his own assumptions and Arminius's convincing facade, trusted him implicitly. This trust, so carefully cultivated by Arminius, would prove to be the deadliest weapon in the upcoming ambush. As autumn approached, Varus decided to lead 3 Roman legions, the 17, 18, and 19, along with 6 cohorts of auxiliaries and 3 squadrons of cavalry, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 men, from their summer camps to winter quarters near the Rhine. This wasn't a military campaign. It was a routine march, and as such, the legions were encumbered with a vast baggage train of camp followers, women, children, and supply wagons. This made their column incredibly long, unwieldy, and vulnerable, stretching for miles through dense forests. Arminius, meanwhile, had secretly forged a powerful alliance of Germanic tribes. He skillfully manipulated Varus, feeding him false intelligence about an uprising further north, thereby diverting the Roman column into terrain that was perfectly suited for an ambush, the dense, boggy, and heavily wooded Teutoburg forest. It was here, over several days, that the trap was sprung. The German tribes, hidden by the thick forest and exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain, launched a series of devastating hit-and-run attacks. The Roman legions, accustomed to open-field battles and disciplined formations, were completely unsuited for this type of asymmetric warfare. Their long, stretched-out column was easily broken up, and their superior organization dissolved into chaos. Rain and storms further complicated matters, turning the forest floor into a muddy swamp, making it difficult for the Romans to move their heavy equipment or maintain formation. Trees were felled across their path, creating barricades, and the heavily armed German warriors rained javelins and arrows from concealed positions. It was a nightmare of close-quarters combat, where Roman discipline and training were rendered largely ineffective. The fighting raged for 3 days. The Roman legions, despite their bravery, were systematically annihilated. Varus, facing utter defeat and unwilling to be captured, famously committed suicide, falling on his sword. Very few Romans escaped the carnage. Estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 Romans were killed, a staggering loss that sent shockwaves throughout the empire. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, is said to have cried out in despair, "Quintili ver, legions red. Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest marked a decisive turning point in Roman history. It halted Roman expansion beyond the Rhine and effectively established the Rhine-Danube frontier as the lasting boundary of the Roman Empire for centuries. The blunder was a profound failure of intelligence, a catastrophic underestimation of a seemingly barbarian foe, and a stark lesson in the dangers of cultural arrogance. It taught Rome that not all peoples could be conquered by conventional means, and that a deep understanding of the enemy and their environment was as crucial as military might. This ancient disaster, born of arrogance and a lack of local insight, finds a modern echo in a seemingly small-scale invasion that spiraled into a colossal geopolitical embarrassment. Our next blunder brings us into the tumultuous theater of the Cold War, a period defined by proxy conflicts, ideological clashes, and a pervasive undercurrent of paranoia. Our focus narrows to April 1961 and a stretch of Cuban coastline known as the Bay of Pigs. This was not a large-scale war, but a clandestine operation, conceived with the best of intentions, at least from the perspective of its architects, but executed with such spectacular incompetence that it became a textbook example of how not to conduct covert operations. The protagonist of this tale is the newly inaugurated U.S. President John F. Kennedy, who inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration. The objective: overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. The strategy: secretly train and equip a force of Cuban exiles, then launch an invasion that would spark a popular uprising against Castro, seemingly without direct American involvement. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was the mastermind behind this covert venture. They recruited and trained Brigade 2506, a group of Cuban exiles deeply committed to liberating their homeland. On paper, the plan probably looked plausible, if not brilliantly conceived. In reality, it was built on a series of profoundly flawed assumptions and a startling lack of foresight. The first major blunder was the assumption of a widespread popular uprising. The CIA believed that once the exiles landed, the Cuban populace, fed up with Castro, would immediately flock to their side, providing the necessary groundswell of support to topple the regime. This was a grave misreading of the situation on the ground. Castro, despite his authoritarian tendencies, still enjoyed significant support, especially among the rural poor. The second blunder involved secrecy, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Despite being a covert operation, the training of the Cuban exiles in Guatemala was an open secret. Castro's intelligence services were well aware of the preparations, and he had ample time to prepare his defenses. The element of surprise, crucial for any clandestine operation, was entirely absent. Furthermore, a planned series of preliminary airstrikes, intended to cripple Castro's small air force, were dramatically scaled back by President Kennedy at the last minute, in an attempt to downplay direct American involvement. This decision, while politically understandable, left Castro's air force largely intact, a critical oversight that would prove devastating. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, armed and equipped by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs. Their landing craft immediately encountered unforeseen obstacles. Unexpected coral reefs ripped open their boats, leading to delays and the loss of precious equipment. This was a minor, yet indicative, early sign of the poor planning. The invasion quickly devolved into a disaster. Castro's forces, well prepared and superior in number, rapidly converged on the landing sites. Without the anticipated air cover, the exiles' ships were attacked and sunk by Cuban planes, cutting off their supply lines and their escape route. The promised popular uprising never materialized. Instead, the local population either remained neutral or actively supported Castro. The exiles found themselves isolated, surrounded, and quickly running out of ammunition. The expected air support from the U.S., including a crucial second airstrike, was canceled by Kennedy, again for fear of revealing overt American involvement. This left the exiles utterly exposed. Within 3 days, the invasion was crushed. Most of Brigade 2506 were killed or captured, with over 1,100 prisoners taken. The prisoners were later exchanged for food and medical supplies, a humiliating deal for the United States. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a spectacular and highly public foreign policy blunder. It significantly strengthened Castro's position in Cuba, solidifying his anti-American stance and pushing him further into the arms of the Soviet Union. It also severely embarrassed the young Kennedy administration, casting a shadow of doubt over its competence on the world stage. The blunder stemmed from a toxic combination of groupthink, wishful thinking, poor intelligence assessment, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the target country's political landscape. It was a painful lesson in the limits of covert action, the dangers of hubris, and the catastrophic consequences of plans built on shaky foundations. This humiliating defeat would undoubtedly inform future U.S. foreign policy, leading to a more cautious approach, a stark contrast to our next tale of monumental military failure, where an entire fleet embarked on a colossal journey only to meet a devastating, yet utterly predictable end. From the political quagmire of the Bay of Pigs, we set sail, quite literally, into one of the most decisive and humiliating naval blunders in history, the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905. This was the defining naval engagement of the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict born from imperial ambitions clashing in East Asia. The Russian Empire, a vast land power, harbored dreams of expanding its influence into Korea and Manchuria, colliding directly with the rising imperial ambitions of Japan. The war itself had been going poorly for Russia. Their Pacific fleet, stationed at Port Arthur, had been largely neutralized by the Japanese Navy, and their land forces were struggling against the surprisingly effective Japanese army. Desperate to turn the tide, Tsar Nicholas II made a decision of almost unimaginable audacity and profound logistical folly. He ordered the Baltic Fleet, stationed thousands of miles away in Europe, to sail halfway across the world to reinforce the Pacific. Imagine this, a fleet of 38 warships, including 7 modern battleships, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, embarking on an epic 8-month, 18,000 nautical mile journey from the Baltic Sea, around Africa, through the Indian Ocean, and finally towards the East Asian theater. This was a logistical undertaking of Herculean proportions, even for a modern navy. For the Russian fleet of 1904, it was an invitation to disaster. The first major blunder was the sheer impracticality and poor condition of the fleet. Many of the ships were outdated, poorly maintained, and their crews were largely reservists with minimal training. The voyage itself was a slow-motion catastrophe. Coaling stations were scarce, requiring the fleet to rely heavily on German merchant ships to resupply them with coal in international waters, a time-consuming and often chaotic process. The cramped, unsanitary conditions, the suffocating heat of the tropics, and the constant stress took a severe toll on the morale and health of the sailors. Adding to the absurdity, in one memorable incident, the Russian fleet mistook British fishing trawlers in the North Sea for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire, causing an international incident known as the Dogger Bank Incident. This showcased the fleet's general state of nervousness, poor training, and trigger happiness. By the time the fleet, under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, finally reached the Straits of Tsushima, between Korea and Japan, in May 1905, it was a shadow of its former self. Ships were encrusted with marine growth, significantly reducing their speed. Their hulls were clogged with coal dust and refuse, making them vulnerable to fire. The gun crews, after months at sea without proper training or target practice, were woefully inaccurate. The Japanese combined fleet, under the brilliant Admiral Hihikaro Togo, meanwhile, was meticulously prepared. Their ships were faster, their crews better trained and more experienced, and their gunnery vastly superior. Togo had chosen his moment, ambushing the exhausted Russian fleet as it attempted to pass through the Tsushima Strait, the quickest route to Vladivostok. The battle itself, on May 27 to 28, 1905, was less a fight and more an execution. Togo famously employed the crossing the T maneuver, allowing his ships to unleash full broadsides on the Russian column, which could only reply with their forward guns. The Russian ships, hampered by their slow speed and poor aim, became floating targets. Their shells often failed to detonate it, or simply missed. Japanese shells, conversely, ripped through Russian armor, causing massive explosions and fires. Within hours, the Russian Baltic fleet was utterly annihilated. Of the 38 ships, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 were disarmed and interned in neutral ports. Only 3 ships managed to escape to Vladivostok, and those arrived in terrible condition. Over 4,500 Russian sailors were killed, and nearly 6,000 captured. The Japanese, by contrast, lost only 3 torpedo boats and 117 men. The Battle of Tsushima was a military disaster of epic proportions for Russia, a profound display of naval incompetence and logistical overstretch. It exposed the rot within the Tsarist regime and contributed directly to the unrest that would culminate in the 1905 Russian Revolution. The blunder was a clear case of underestimating a determined, well-prepared enemy, while simultaneously overestimating one's own capabilities and ignoring the basic realities of naval warfare and long-distance logistics. It was a painful, conclusive demonstration that simply having a lot of ships isn't enough if they're slow, poorly maintained, and commanded by an exhausted, demoralized force. This catastrophic naval defeat underscores the perils of failing to adapt to evolving military realities, a lesson also painfully learned by a certain European power that built an impressive, yet ultimately irrelevant, defensive line. Our journey through military missteps now takes us to the interwar period, a time of anxious peace and simmering tensions that would eventually erupt into the Second World War. Our subject, the Maginot Line, a monument to defensive thinking that, for all its impressive engineering, became a symbol of strategic obsolescence. After the horrors of World War I, particularly the devastating trench warfare that bled France white, the nation was understandably scarred. They had lost millions of men, and the idea of another frontal assault on their soil was unthinkable. The solution, or so they believed, was to build an impregnable defensive barrier along their eastern border with Germany. This was the genesis of the Maginot Line, named after André Maginot, the French Minister of War who championed its construction. Work began in the late 1920s and continued into the 1930s. This wasn't just a ditch or a few bunkers. It was a marvel of military engineering. The line consisted of a vast network of interconnected fortifications, underground tunnels, barracks, command posts, hospitals, and supply depots. It boasted thick concrete walls, anti-tank obstacles, and formidable artillery turrets designed to withstand the heaviest bombardments. The Maginot Line was designed to be self-sufficient and capable of holding out for extended periods, a truly impressive feat of defensive architecture. It was intended to deter a direct German invasion, forcing any aggressor to either attack through Switzerland, which was deemed too mountainous, or through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. Herein lay the central, catastrophic blunder of the Maginot Line, its strategic inflexibility. The French military leadership, still mentally fighting the last war, focused overwhelmingly on preventing a repeat of the devastating frontal assaults of 1914 to 1918. They believed that the line was impenetrable, a steel and concrete shield that would funnel any German attack into predictable, defensible corridors. However, they made two critical miscalculations. First, they failed to extend the line fully along the Franco-Belgian border. This was partly due to political considerations. Belgium didn't want to provoke Germany by being seen as part of a joint defensive line, and partly due to a belief that the Ardennes, a densely forested and hilly region, was impassable for modern mechanized armies. This assumption, like many optimistic assumptions in military history, proved to be catastrophically wrong. The second, and perhaps more profound, blunder was an intellectual one. The French general staff became overly reliant on the concept of static defense, failing to fully grasp the revolutionary changes occurring in military doctrine. While they were building their concrete masterpiece, the Germans were developing blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine that emphasized rapid, coordinated attacks by tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support, designed to bypass static defenses, punch deep into enemy territory, and exploit breakthroughs. The Maginot Line was designed to fight a war that no longer existed. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, the Maginot Line proved precisely what it was built to be: impregnable. German forces never even attempted a direct frontal assault against the strongest parts of the line. Instead, in a move that shocked the world, the Wehrmacht simply bypassed it entirely. General Erich von Manstein's audacious plan, which became known as the Sickle Cut, involved a massive armored thrust through the impassable Ardennes forest, outflanking the entire Maginot Line and trapping the Allied forces in Belgium. The speed and unexpected nature of the German advance, combined with the unpreparedness of the Allied forces to counter such a mobile threat, led to the rapid collapse of French defenses. Tanks, which the Maginot Line was never truly designed to stop in a full-scale offensive through a flanking maneuver, simply drove around it. While individual garrisons within the Maginot Line fought bravely, they were rendered strategically irrelevant. They became isolated islands of resistance, easily contained and bypassed, or eventually surrendered due to being cut off from supply and command. The Maginot Line, for all its cost and engineering brilliance, was a monumental strategic blunder. It consumed vast resources that could have been used to build tanks, aircraft, or develop more flexible, mobile defenses. It instilled a false sense of security in the French leadership, leading to a dangerous complacency about the nature of modern warfare. It stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest military blunders are not on the battlefield, but in the war rooms, in the strategic assumptions, and in the failure to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Its grand, yet ultimately futile, design serves as a stark contrast to the surprising resilience of a small nation facing a seemingly insurmountable invasion, a story that unveils the harsh realities of underestimating an adversary's will. From the static defenses of the Maginot Line, we turn our gaze northward to the brutal, frozen landscapes of Finland in the winter of 1939 to 1940. Here, we encounter a military blunder born not of over-reliance on technology, but of monumental arrogance and a profound underestimation of a small nation's will and capacity for resistance. Our protagonist, or rather, our antagonist, is the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Having signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, which included a secret protocol carving up Eastern Europe, the Soviets sought to secure their borders, particularly Leningrad, which lay uncomfortably close to the Finnish frontier. Their demand was simple. Finland must cede territory, including parts of the Karelian Isthmus, and lease naval bases. Finland, a newly independent nation with a fierce sense of national pride and sovereignty, politely but firmly refused. Stalin, enraged by this defiance from a country he considered a mere pawn in the geopolitical game, decided to take what he wanted by force. His assessment was based on sheer numerical superiority and a deep-seated contempt for the Finnish military. The Soviet Red Army, on paper, was a behemoth, millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft. Finland, by contrast, had a small, poorly equipped army of around 300,000 men, with virtually no tanks and a tiny air force. The prevailing Soviet military doctrine, largely influenced by the purges of experienced officers, was that the Finns were weak, their morale low, and that a single powerful blow would shatter their resistance. Soviet propaganda even went so far as to claim that the Finnish proletariat would rise up to greet their Soviet liberators. This was, as history would brutally demonstrate, a catastrophic misjudgment, a blunder of epic proportions driven by ideological dogma, and a staggering lack of understanding of the enemy's resolve and the unique challenges of the Finnish terrain. On November 30th, 1939, the Red Army launched a massive invasion of Finland. Soviet generals optimistically predicted victory within a few weeks, perhaps even days. What followed was a stark, brutal demonstration of how raw numbers mean little without proper training, leadership, and an understanding of the environment. The Finnish landscape was a strategic nightmare for a conventional, mechanized army. Dense, snow-covered forests, frozen lakes, and lack of developed roads funneled the Soviet columns into narrow tracks, making them vulnerable to ambush. The Finnish army, led by the brilliant Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, adopted a strategy perfectly suited to their circumstances. They were masters of Mahdi tactics, cutting off Soviet columns into small, isolated pockets, then encircling and systematically destroying them. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, their superior cross-country skiing skills, and their camouflage, white snow suits against the Soviets' dark uniforms, to devastating effect. The Soviet soldiers, often poorly clothed for the extreme Arctic conditions, were freezing, starving, and demoralized. Their tanks, designed for open plains, became bogged down in deep snow or were easily knocked out by Finnish anti-tank teams, often using simple Molotov cocktails, named after the Soviet foreign minister. The most chilling aspect of this blunder was the utter unpreparedness of the Soviet forces for the climate. Troops froze to death in their sleeping bags. Equipment seized up. Supply lines, already strained by the vast distances and the primitive infrastructure, collapsed under the relentless cold and Finnish attacks. The Soviets suffered horrendous casualties. In one infamous instance, the 44th Rifle Division, a force of 17,500 men, was completely annihilated in the Battle of Rate Road by a Finnish force less than a tenth its size. The road became a graveyard of frozen Soviet bodies and destroyed vehicles. By the end of the Winter War in March 1940, despite eventually forcing Finland to cede territory due to overwhelming numerical superiority and a desperate peace treaty, the Soviet Union had paid an exorbitant price. While official Soviet figures are likely understated, estimates range from 126,000 to over 380,000 Soviet casualties, compared to around 26,000 Finnish dead. The blunder of the Winter War was a profound embarrassment for the Soviet Union on the world stage. It exposed the Red Army's deep structural problems, poor leadership, inadequate training, and a fatal disregard for logistical realities and enemy capabilities. It gave Hitler a dangerously inflated view of the Red Army's weakness, directly influencing his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. The Finnish Arctic Awakening stands as a testament to the fact that courage, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of one's own environment can often overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. It's a sobering reminder that believing you are invincible is often the quickest path to a very painful and utterly avoidable defeat. This chilling tale of misjudgment foreshadows our next historical misstep, where similar overconfidence and a stark underestimation of a local foe led to a devastating and iconic last stand. From the frozen forests of Finland, we travel westward across the Atlantic to the sun-baked plains of the American frontier in June 1876. Here, in the dusty expanse of Montana Territory, a legendary figure of American military history, General George Armstrong Custer, would commit a series of blunders that culminated in his most famous and final act, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer, a flamboyant and ambitious Civil War hero, was known for his dashing persona and sometimes reckless bravery. By 1876, he was a lieutenant colonel commanding the 7th Cavalry Regiment, tasked with forcing the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne tribes onto reservations. The United States government's policy was clear: quell Native American resistance and open up the West for white settlement, especially after gold was discovered in the Black Hills, sacred lands to the Sioux. The stage was set for conflict. The Native American tribes, under the spiritual leadership of Sitting Bull and the tactical brilliance of Crazy Horse, had gathered in an unprecedentedly large encampment on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. They were determined to protect their way of life and their lands. U.S. strategy involved a three-pronged attack, with converging columns designed to trap the Native Americans. Custer's 7th Cavalry was one of these columns. Here's where the blunders began to pile up, like so many dominoes awaiting their dramatic topple. Custer, Driven by ambition and a desire for personal glory, he allegedly wanted to make a name for himself before the upcoming presidential election, displayed a shocking disregard for intelligence and caution. He was explicitly ordered to wait for the other columns before engaging, but he chose to push ahead, fearing the Native Americans would disperse if he delayed. This was a classic case of a commander prioritizing personal ambition over strategic coordination. His second significant blunder was a gross underestimation of the enemy's strength and resolve. Custer believed the Native American encampment was much smaller than it actually was. He assumed they would flee at the sight of his cavalry, rather than stand and fight. This overconfidence was fatal. The encampment was, in fact, one of the largest gatherings of Native American warriors in history, possibly numbering thousands. The final, and arguably most critical, tactical blunder was Custer's decision to divide his forces. Approaching the massive encampment on June 25th, Custer split his regiment into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen was sent on a wide flanking maneuver to the left, and Custer himself led 5 companies to attack from the north. This dispersal of forces, particularly against an enemy of unknown but potentially superior numbers, was a cardinal sin in military tactics. It made each isolated detachment vulnerable to being overwhelmed. Reno's attack quickly faltered. His men, facing overwhelming numbers, were forced to retreat to a defensive position on a nearby bluff, suffering heavy casualties. Benteen, after his flanking maneuver proved fruitless, eventually joined Reno on the bluff. Custer, meanwhile, with his 5 companies, roughly 210 men, encountered the main body of the Native American warriors. He was surprised by their numbers and ferocity. The Native Americans, fighting for their homes and families, showed no inclination to flee. Led by Crazy Horse and other war leaders, they swiftly encircled Custer's command. The battle on Last Stand Hill was swift and brutal. Custer and all of his men were killed. Not a single man from Custer's immediate command survived. It was a complete and utter annihilation, a rare event in military history, especially for a well-equipped modern army. The Battle of Little Bighorn, often called Custer's Last Stand, was a profound military disaster for the United States. It was a blunder rooted in arrogant overconfidence, a disregard for orders, a catastrophic underestimation of the enemy, and a failure of basic tactical principles. While it was a temporary victory for the Native Americans, it ultimately solidified the U.S. government's resolve to crush their resistance, leading to increased military campaigns. Custer's calamity serves as a timeless cautionary tale. Even the most celebrated military figures are fallible, and the most dangerous enemy is often the one you refuse to take seriously. This infamous defeat on the American plains sets the stage for our next examination of military miscalculation, moving from the tactical to the geopolitical, and witnessing how an international power play can spectacularly backfire. From the dusty plains where Custer met his fate, we transition to the geopolitical chessboard of the mid-20th century, specifically the autumn of 1956. Our focus shifts to the Suez Crisis, a series of catastrophic blunders that weren't just military, but deeply political and diplomatic, revealing the painful decline of old empires and the rise of new global powers. This intricate drama involved 3 main actors, Britain, France, and Israel, acting in concert against Egypt, then led by its charismatic and fiercely nationalistic president Gamal Abdel Nasser. The central fuse for this explosive situation was the Suez Canal, a vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, a shortcut for global trade, especially oil. While nominally Egyptian territory, it was controlled by a British and French-owned company, a lingering symbol of colonial power. Nasser, a champion of Arab nationalism, deeply resented this foreign control. His grand plan was to fund the Aswan Dam, a monumental infrastructure project using loans from the United States and Britain. However, when those loans were suddenly withdrawn due to Nasser's perceived flirtation with the Soviet bloc, he retaliated with a dramatic and perfectly legal move. He nationalized the Suez Canal Company on July 26, 1956. This act, while popular in Egypt and the Arab world, sent shockwaves through London and Paris. For Britain, the canal was a strategic lifeline, vital for its trade and access to its remaining colonies. For France, it was about national pride and, more practically, a response to Nasser's support for Algerian independence fighters. Both saw Nasser's act as a direct challenge to their influence and a violation of international norms, at least their interpretation of them. The blunder began with the secret plotting. Instead of pursuing diplomatic solutions or seeking broader international consensus, Britain and France, in a breathtaking display of colonial-era thinking, concocted a secret plan with Israel. The plan, hatched in secrecy at Sèvres, France, was as convoluted as it was reckless. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, creating a pretext for Britain and France to intervene as peacekeepers, ostensibly to protect the canal and separate the combatants. In reality, their true objective was to seize control of the canal and, if possible, topple Nasser. This was a classic old-world imperialist maneuver, utterly out of step with the emerging post-colonial international order. On October 29th, Israel launched its invasion of the Sinai. 2 days later, Britain and France issued an ultimatum to both sides, demanding they withdraw their forces from the canal zone. When Nasser, predictably, refused to withdraw Egyptian forces from their own territory, Britain and France launched their invasion, bombing Egyptian airfields and landing paratroopers. The military operation itself, codenamed Operation Musketeer, was relatively successful in its limited tactical objectives. British and French forces quickly overwhelmed the Egyptian military, demonstrating their superior training and equipment. The canal zone was secured. However, the military success was irrelevant in the face of the international outrage that ensued. The political blunder was immense. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was furious. Not only had its allies lied to it and embarked on a war without consultation, but their actions severely undermined Western efforts to counter Soviet influence in the Middle East and jeopardized global oil supplies. The Soviet Union also condemned the invasion and threatened military intervention. The United Nations overwhelmingly voted for a ceasefire. Facing immense diplomatic pressure, financial sanctions from the U.S., which threatened to devalue the British pound, and a global outcry, Britain and France were forced to back down in humiliation. They ordered a ceasefire on November 6th and eventually withdrew their forces. The Suez Crisis was a catastrophic geopolitical blunder for Britain and France. It exposed their diminished power on the world stage, accelerating the process of decolonization. It elevated Nasser's standing as a champion of Arab nationalism and solidified Soviet influence in the region. For Israel, while a military success, it complicated their international standing and failed to achieve long-term security. The blunder was a failure of foresight, a misjudgment of the post-war international landscape, and a stark lesson that military might alone cannot overcome political and diplomatic isolation. It taught the world that the age of overt gunboat diplomacy by old colonial powers was over, setting the stage for more complex conflicts, such as the struggle for independence that would soon challenge another major power in Southeast Asia. Our next significant blunder transports us to the rugged, remote valleys of northern Vietnam in 1954, where a colonial power, France, would suffer a catastrophic defeat that effectively ended its imperial ambitions in Southeast Asia. This was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a military miscalculation born of strategic arrogance, a profound underestimation of an indigenous enemy, and a failure to learn from the lessons of guerrilla warfare. Following World War II, France sought to reassert control over its Indo-Chinese colonies, but they were met by a fierce nationalist independence movement, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and commanded militarily by General Vong Nguyen Giap. The First Indochina War had been a grinding, frustrating conflict for the French, marked by their inability to decisively defeat the Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics. In 1953, the French High Command, desperate for a decisive victory that would force the Viet Minh to the negotiating table, conceived a bold, yet incredibly flawed, plan. Their idea was to establish a heavily fortified airbase in a remote valley, Dien Bien Phu, near the Laotian border. The reasoning was deceptively simple. Dien Bien Phu lay across Viet Minh supply lines to Laos and was a strategic crossroads. By building a strong base there, supplied entirely by air, the French believed they could lure the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle, where French superior firepower and air support would finally annihilate them. It was, in essence, an attempt to replicate a conventional European battle in the middle of a Vietnamese jungle, a tactic that had served them poorly for years. The French commander, General Henri Navarre, viewed Dien Bien Phu as an airland base, a fortified camp from which French forces could disrupt Viet Minh operations and force them into open combat. He dismissed warnings that the surrounding hills could allow the Viet Minh to bring in heavy artillery, believing the terrain was too difficult. He also severely underestimated the Viet Minh's logistical capabilities and their sheer will to fight. This was the central blunder. The French created an isolated, vulnerable fortress, effectively trapping their own forces in a bowl, surrounded by hills that they confidently, and wrongly, assumed could not be exploited by the enemy. For the Viet Minh, Dien Bien Phu was a gift. It was exactly the kind of set-piece battle they had initially avoided, but now, with the French dug in, it became a golden opportunity. General Giap, a self-taught military genius, understood the terrain and the psychology of his enemy far better than the French understood him. His strategy was audacious. Use tens of thousands of civilian porters, often on bicycles, to manually transport artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, and supplies, piece by laborious piece, through dense jungle and over treacherous mountains. They built miles of hidden roads and tunnels, dragging heavy equipment by hand, undetected by French aerial reconnaissance. This was a logistical miracle, a triumph of human will and ingenuity that completely blindsided the French. The siege began in March 1954. To the French horror, the Viet Minh began to bombard the base with heavy artillery from the surrounding hills. Their anti-aircraft guns, seemingly appearing out of nowhere, began to decimate French supply planes, severely limiting vital resupply and reinforcement. The French airstrip, their lifeline, quickly became unusable. The French forces, numbering around 15,000, found themselves trapped, pounded by relentless artillery fire, and facing increasingly aggressive human wave assaults from the Viet Minh. The fortified positions, once thought impregnable, were systematically overrun. As weeks turned into months, the situation became desperate. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medicine dwindled. The wounded piled up, unable to be evacuated. The French garrison fought with immense bravery, but they were outmaneuvered, outsupplied, and ultimately overwhelmed. On May 7, 1954, after 56 days of brutal fighting, Dien Bien Phu fell. The defeat was an unmitigated disaster for France. Over 2,000 French soldiers were killed, and more than 10,000 were captured, many dying in Viet Minh prison camps. It marked the definitive end of French colonial rule in Indochina and paved the way for the division of Vietnam and the subsequent American involvement. The blunder at Dien Bien Phu was a classic case of a conventional military power failing to adapt to asymmetric warfare. It was a failure of intelligence, a profound underestimation of an enemy's capabilities and resolve, and a costly adherence to outdated strategic thinking. It stands as a powerful reminder that military strength is not just about technology and firepower. It's also about understanding the terrain, the enemy, and, crucially, learning when to abandon a flawed plan. This devastating colonial miscalculation perfectly illustrates how arrogance can blind even the most powerful, leading directly to a final historical misstep that combines elements of cunning, overconfidence, and an infamous, deceptively simple gift. Our final journey into the realm of catastrophic military blunders takes us back to the dawn of recorded history, to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Troy, and a tale so legendary, it has become a timeless metaphor for cunning deception and fatal overconfidence. The Trojan horse, while often considered a mythical event, perfectly encapsulates a military blunder of epic proportions, the failure to adequately assess a perceived gift and a catastrophic lapse in defensive vigilance. For 10 long years, the Achaeans, a coalition of Greek city-states, had besieged the mighty city of Troy. Troy was formidable, protected by towering, seemingly impregnable walls and defended by brave warriors. The Achaean armies, despite their legendary heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, had failed to breach these defenses. The siege had become a brutal, costly stalemate, draining both sides of resources and morale. This protracted deadlock led to the ultimate strategic problem for the Achaeans: how to get inside the walls of Troy when direct assault had proven utterly futile. The solution, credited to the cunning mind of Odysseus, was as brilliant in its conception as it was devastating in its execution. The plan involved building a colossal wooden horse, ostensibly as an offering to the goddess Athena, to appease her for the Greeks' long siege and ensure a safe voyage home. But this was no mere gift. It was a Trojan horse in the most literal sense. Inside its hollow belly, a select group of elite Achaean warriors, including Odysseus himself, concealed themselves. The Achaeans then packed up their camps, set fire to their tents, and sailed away, seemingly abandoning the siege. They left behind only the gigantic wooden horse and one man, Sinon, a master of deceit. Sinon's role was crucial. He presented himself to the Trojans as a deserter, claiming that the Achaeans had abandoned the siege due to divine displeasure and that the horse was a sacred offering, designed to be too large to fit inside the city, ensuring Troy's misfortune if they destroyed it, and its prosperity if they brought it in. He spun a tale of Greek impiety, of Achilles' death, and of the horse being a way for the Greeks to secure a safe return home, ensuring Athena's favor for Troy if they brought it into the city. Here lies the catastrophic blunder on the part of the Trojans. After a decade of brutal warfare, with their city battered but unbroken, the Trojans were tired. They were desperate for the siege to end, for the endless suffering to cease. When they saw the seemingly abandoned Greek camp and the enormous horse, a wave of relief, combined with a potent mix of credulity and celebratory hubris, swept over them. Despite warnings from Cassandra, the prophetess whose prophecies were cursed to never be believed, and Laocoon, a priest who famously declared, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts, especially a large, wooden one," the Trojans ignored the red flags. Laocoon even hurled a spear at the horse to prove it was hollow, and was subsequently devoured by sea serpents, an act seen by the Trojans as divine retribution for his impiety, further cementing their belief in the horse's sanctity. The Trojans, blinded by the promise of peace and a glorious victory, literally dismantled a section of their impregnable walls to bring the enormous wooden horse into their city. It was an act of profound strategic negligence, a monumental failure of due diligence driven by wishful thinking. They celebrated late into the night, believing their ordeal was finally over. As the city slept in a drunken stupor, the Achaean warriors emerged from the belly of the horse. They silently opened the city gates, allowing the rest of the Greek army, who had secretly returned under the cover of darkness, to stream into Troy. The city, which had withstood 10 years of direct assault, fell in a single night. The ensuing sack of Troy was brutal and devastating, marking the end of the mighty city. The Trojan horse serves as a timeless cautionary tale against naive acceptance, against the dangers of celebrating too soon, and against underestimating the cunning of a desperate enemy. It's a vivid illustration of how even the strongest defenses can be utterly circumvented not by brute force, but by psychological manipulation and a profound failure of critical judgment. This ancient, yet eternally relevant, blunder concludes our journey through history's most catastrophic military missteps, leaving us with the enduring wisdom that vigilance, skepticism, and a healthy dose of humility are often the most formidable defenses against self-inflicted disaster. As we bring our exploration of catastrophic military blunders to a close, it becomes strikingly clear that while the weapons, tactics, and empires change, the fundamental human elements that lead to such colossal failures remain remarkably consistent. From the hubris of ancient Rome to the technological blind spots of the Cold War and the strategic inflexibility of interwar Europe, we've witnessed how overconfidence, miscommunication, ignored intelligence, and a failure to adapt can unravel even the most meticulously laid plans. These stories serve as more than just historical anecdotes. They are enduring lessons in the fragility of power, the importance of critical thinking, and the timeless need for humility in the face of uncertainty. The quiet echoes of these past blunders remind us that vigilance, adaptability, and a healthy skepticism towards assumed invincibility are perhaps the most potent defenses against future self-inflicted wounds. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. May your mind be calm, your body relaxed, and your sleep deep and restorative. Good night.